Hi everyone, welcome to the January 10th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and we are looking back at last week's racing from across the country. And Craig, 3-year-olds were definitely the focus of this past weekend. We had some of the Derby preps start to take place, some of the lesser Derby preps, the 10-point to the winter Derby preps at places like Santa Anita and Aqueduct. But, it's the beginning of the Derby Trail. Some connections are starting to dream. The fans are starting to get a little bit invested in these races. So it's always an exciting time of year.
Yeah, it's good. It kind of reminds me I got to get our TimeformUS spreadsheet going with all the prep races people will be asking me about. I've been a little lazy on that front, but I will get that going. And it's always kind of fun to track these horses as they go through and lead all the way up to the first Saturday in May.
In addition to some of those stakes that I mentioned, particularly the Sham and the Jerome, we also saw some allowance and maiden races run by 3-year-olds that achieved some speed figures that might, signal horses that could have futures in stakes races. So we'll talk about some of those throughout the podcast. There were also some stakes for older horses through the week that earned some 120 plus TimeformUS speed figures. So we'll discuss those in a little bit, possibly some horses with some bigger targets on the horizon in the future. But Craig, let's start things off at Santa Anita out west this week, where they had a big stakes day on Saturday of California Cup race, and we're not going to talk about those races, even though we handicapped a few of them last week. But I think a lot of fans tuned in on Sunday at Santa Anita because they did run a couple of 3-year-old stakes races, one for the males, one for the females. The Grade 3 Sham, which was the Derby prep, was featured 4 Bob Baffert runners that were entered. He scratched one of them, so Bob went with a trio, and I guess unsurprisingly, they went 1, 2, 3. That was particularly due to the fact that one of the runners that was expected to challenge them came out of the race with a minor injury, a spun intended, but Bob dominated this one, and it was the biggest price of his trio that got the job done.
Yeah, and we often joke about, the other Baffert or the other Pletcher, or in this case, the other, but we don't often see him at 16-1, particularly in a small field like we had here of just 5. And Reincarnate, I thought he ran pretty well, and he's a horse who's been improving every single time out on the TimeformUS speed figures. It's going to come back a pretty fast race. I don't have the official TimeformUS speed figure yet, but it looked like a really easy day to me when I glanced at the worksheet, and I'm guessing it's going to be right around the 114 mark. I'd be surprised if that's not within a point one way or the other. And that's a good, strong effort from an early season 3-year-old.
Yeah, it felt like all of the top 3 ran well in this race. I know that the heavy favorite, National Treasure, who was bet down to 3-5, he was the last across the wire of those 3 Bob Baffert trainees, but I wouldn't say that he necessarily lost anything in defeat, Craig. You could argue that he had the toughest trip of these 3 runners because he was just kind of stymied in behind horses for a lot of the race. It seemed like John Velasquez was trying to bump his way out at the top of the stretch, but he kind of had that horse to his outside, spun intended, who was fading and blocking him in, and once he finally did get to the outside, he was finishing decently. I guess you might say you could want to see him show a bit more turn of foot when he did finally get into the clear, but I thought it was a decent 3-year-old debut for him. But take nothing away from that winner, Reincarnate, who, as you said, really stepped up. He had made those 4 starts against Maiden Company, starting on the turf, kind of an unusual move for Bob Baffert, but he's just continued improving with each start, and he seems like a real grinding type who will fight for it when he gets into a bit of a tussle with another horse. So those are all good character traits. We'll see down the line if Reincarnate can do it with a different running style, because he did have things his own way on the lead here.
He did, and he did. Probably, maybe it's too soon, I shouldn't bring it up, but kind of reminded me of Medina Spirit, how when he didn't have that blazing early speed, but when he got to the front, he would just kind of keep grinding, and it was really tough to get past him.
And we didn't mention Newgate, who was seconded here. I mean, I guess he's the one that I have the least interest in coming out of this race. It looked like he was making the winning move at the top of the stretch. He got there. It even seemed like he might have stuck his head in front at a brief point in mid-stretch, but Reincarnate turned him away. And it just seems like Newgate might be the one of these 3 that perhaps won't appreciate added distances down the line.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Maybe the mile is about his limit. He's had his best success in sprint races so far.
Let's move on to the other stakes that was run at Santa Anita on Sunday, the Grade 3 Santa Ynez for the 3-year-old fillies. This one just going one turn, the 7 furlong distance for the fillies. And another, I should say a heavily bet winner here, Ice Dancing, who was coming off a maiden victory where she was a similarly short price. This is a filly that Richard Mandella had tried against Graded Stakes Company when she was a maiden. It didn't run that badly in those races, beaten 3 times by Tell Me No Lies, who was that multiple Graded Stakes winner last year as a 2-year-old in Southern California. But now she's made it 2 in a row, Craig, obviously not beating the toughest field here.
No, and it's not going to come back a very fast race. This was an odd day at Santa Anita where this was the only sprint on the card, but it lined up perfectly with the route, so I don't think the speed figure is going to be anything tough to make. And it's going to come back pretty slow, about just a 97. I'm not going to hold that too much against the winner. It was basically a paid workout. I don't think there was a lot in here, but she hasn't run all that fast, so I'm going to need to see more from her personally.
Yeah, she's a daughter of Frosted who kind of gives the physical impression that she's going to handle more ground. She did break her maiden going a 2-turn mile at Del Mar, so, I mean, that does say that longer distances could be in her future, even though they cut her back to 7 furlongs here. I guess that was just the race that came up and they wanted to keep her in a rhythm. They'll probably go longer with her next time, and I think she'll handle it, but like you said, she's going to have to start to run some faster speed figures if she's going to be a serious player in this 3-year-old filly division, though, Craig, we talked about it a little bit at the end of last year. There's a big disparity between the kinds of speed figures that the colts are running and the fillies are running, at least in this current crop of 3-year-olds. We just haven't seen the fillies run particularly fast, even in the Grade 1 races.
Yeah, it's really kind of a weird dynamic because, I mean, it seems like it wasn't that long ago where 2-year-old fillies would be just as fast or faster than the colts for a pretty sustained amount of time, and it just seems to have vanished. Not sure what's happened, if it has to do with the training or if it's just one of those fluky, aberrant things that happen from time to time, but it's definitely something that's been happening for at least seems like about 3 years now.
And like I mentioned, they ran that Cal Cup Day at Santa Anita on Saturday. We're not going to talk about any of those California-bred races, though I will just say the Chosen Vron, who did win the California Cup Sprint, the first race of the day on Saturday, he's a pretty cool horse. Made a little close at 2-5, but he just loves to win races, so definitely one that you can easily be a fan of over on the Southern California circuit. But Craig, I do want to talk about a maiden race that they ran on that Saturday card for the 3-year-old California-bred fillies, because we had a second-time starter, Sassy Nature, who won by nearly 10 lengths and ran the kind of speed figure that suggests she might be as fast as any of the open company 3-year-old fillies in Southern California.
Yeah, she's getting a 103 speed figure for that win. She was a horse who kind of ran off in her debut at the start, opened up a big lead going way too fast. But when you look at the trainer, Luis Mendez on TimeformUS, he's not very good with first-time starters. His ratings take a big jump with second-time starters. And boy, did we see it here. She looked like a totally different horse. Once again, she showed that really good speed early, but she just kept right on going and basically ran off the screen, putting away a horse who had finished ahead of her last time.
Yeah, this was a visually impressive win, and you could see right out of the starting gate, she was much more relaxed than she had been in her debut. I mean, in that debut race at Del Mar, she busted out of the gate like a quarter horse, and she was almost running that fast for the opening quarter mile, so you can kind of understand why she faded at the end that day. They took the blinkers off in this race, they added Lasix, and it seemed like that combination of differences really helped her finish off this race much better last Saturday, because she was really running through the wire powerfully. Kind of an unusual thing that I noticed watching this race, Craig. If you go back and watch the replay, you'll see it if you're looking for it. When they turn into the stretch, when she's changing over to her right lead, she only changes with her front legs. And I was just asking this question on Twitter to some horse people that know this better than I do, but the term is cross-firing, I believe, when she's on her right lead in her front legs, but she was on her left lead in her back legs, and it just looks awkward, and you can see her actually change over to her right lead in her back legs only at about the 8th pole in this race. I mean, she ran almost half of the stretch kind of with that cross-firing action, and it just looks really awkward. I was watching this replay and thinking that she was a really odd mover, and then it kind of clicked when she changed over those back leads in mid-stretch. So just an unusual thing. I can't recall seeing that, especially not in a horse that's winning a race. Sometimes you see it in a horse that's very green. I think a horse that runs in New York, Unique Unions, that's like a high-level allowance horse, New York bred. There was a race where he was doing it. I remember Maggie Wolfendale talking about it, and the jockey pulled him up when he started doing that because he felt like something was wrong. And just rare to see that action in a horse that's actually winning a race and running at top speed. So clearly this filly has some things to figure out if she's going to continue to, be a top horse at this level, but something to look for if you go back and watch this replay.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go watch that because I knew something looked a little weird, but I didn't know what it was. And as long as I've been following this game, I've never heard of that before. It almost sounds like a trotter in harness racing. So yeah, I look forward to giving that a look.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking of too. It's like a thoroughbred breaking stride, except that doesn't really matter as long as they're running fast. It doesn't really matter how they're doing it. But yeah, definitely something to take note of with this impressive winner's sassy nature. Even though she didn't sell for that much, Craig, there's pedigree on this filly, but it's really pedigree to be a sprinter. Her dam is a half sister to American Theorem, that very good Grade 1 winning sprinter in Southern California, and she's by Straight Fire, a California-based sire who I think has had some success with sprint types. So I'm not really sure that I'm viewing this as a filly that's going to stretch out in the future, but she clearly has a lot of speed.
Yeah, and I can't remember if you mentioned she is a Calbred, so at the very least, she's going to have a hard time being beaten by fellow Calbreds if she keeps up with that kind of speed.
I want to mention one more maiden race for the 3-year-old fillies that took place in Southern California this past weekend, going back to Friday's card in the second race of the day. Big upset as Richard Mandela sent out a 19-1 first-time starter winner who was actually the other Mandela-trained spendthrift-owned runner in this race, as Beholder's daughter, Tina Ella, took much more money than the winner, Coffee in Bed. But even though Mike Smith was riding, the bettors didn't go for this one. She was clearly the one that was ready to win on debut, Craig. And even though this race didn't come back that fast, I kind of like the professionalism that this filly displayed.
She did look good. It came back as a 94 speed figure. There wasn't a whole lot of pace in here. It was just kind of an average pace throughout the race. So I'm not going to hold the number against her too much, particularly if she stretches out, which is what you'd expect for her being out of Curlin. She's the kind of horse that I think will definitely get better around 2 turns.
Yeah, and I forget if I mentioned her name, Coffee in Bed, this first-time starter, as you mentioned, by Curlin. There is some good pedigree on the dam side, both from the dam, who has produced toboggan winner Great Stuff, who was placed in the Grade 1 Carter during his career. He spent a while in the David Jacobson barn a number of years ago. And the dam is a half-sister to Bo Liam, as well as some stakes winners on the turf. So it's a really classy female family. Kind of odd that this one didn't take any money, but maybe I was looking up the workouts on XBTV. I can understand why. I mean, there were just a couple workouts showing and they weren't particularly impressive, but just the kind of unimpressive works where it seemed like they weren't really asking for her best in the morning, and clearly she had something more to give in the afternoon. So Coffee in Bed, a daughter of Curlin that maybe you want to keep your eye on as she stretches out in distance. Let's move on to another venue, Aqueduct, across the country on the East Coast, where they also ran a 10-point Kentucky Derby qualifying prep on Saturday. That was the Jerome Stakes, the first in a series of New York preps leading up to the Wood Memorial in April. This one going the one-turn mile, and not always sure if these one-turn mile races are going to have serious ramifications towards the Kentucky Derby, Craig. And Lugan Knight, who won this race, his connections are already saying that they haven't quite caught the Derby fever yet. They're pretty realistic that their horse might not be a Kentucky Derby candidate, just given his pedigree and the fact that he's excelled in one-turn races so far. But he and the runner-up, Arctic Arrogance, did put on a pretty nice show battling to the wire here.
Yeah, this one was basically a match race. It was a pretty lukewarm pace. It's not coded in blue by Timeform US, but it really picked up through the lane. The half mile was a 99, and it gradually improved all the way to a 108 at the wire. So good performance from those two. I think it also probably didn't give the others in behind much of a chance, but that's it. I do think they were clearly the two best. Maybe Arctic Arrogance was the turn back hurt him a little bit in the stretch, having to show a little more speed early. Wasn't able to quite run down Lugan Knight, but I'm kind of with you. I think this might be the limit for Lugan Knight. I imagine he'll get another chance to go long and get that shot to stay on the Derby trail, but I think Arctic Arrogance is the one most likely to go forward in that direction.
Yeah, he's coming out of an allowance race at Churchill Downs that has proven to be quite the key race so far, as the winner Victory Formation came right back to win the Smarty Jones. Now Lucan Knight has come out of that to win the Jerome, so a couple of horses with Derby points out of that same optional claimer at Churchill, just going 6 furlongs back at the end of November. I agree about Lucan Knight. He's got a bit more sprint pedigree on the dam side, even though progeny of Golden Sense generally can do anything, run on turf, short dirt, short or long. It doesn't really matter. Linda Rice has already said Arctic Arrogance likely to go in a different direction, as they're going to look to stretch him back out in his next start and probably try that 1.125 Withers in early February, so he'll get yet another test going the 9 furlong distance after he ran a pretty good second in the Remsen going that trip back at the beginning of December. And I don't have a whole lot to say about the rest of this field, Craig. It was strange to see them elect to rate the other New York bred Andiamo a Firenze, who seemed like the speed of the race, but clearly as soon as they broke, Kendrick Carmouche had no interest in going to the front. He took a hard hold of this horse, kind of like he might have been riding to instructions, and that really affected the pace because it just didn't allow the top two to really, have to do much hard work on the front end, and it really hindered some of the horses trying to come from off of it. But still, I don't want to make too big of an excuse because there was such a big gap after the top two finishers back to the rest of the field.
Yeah, it gets to the point sometimes I just give up on guessing what these connections are trying. I mean, he's a lately raced 3-year-old. I guess they're figuring the distance might be a problem. I never understand the trying to rate horses when you think distance is a problem, because if they're going to run well, it's going to be up front.
The other stakes on that Saturday card at Aqueduct that was originally supposed to be run on, I think, New Year's Eve, back December 31st, but rescheduled after they canceled that day of racing due to heavy fog, and that's the Queens County Stakes for the older horses going the 1.125 distance, and we had a pretty dominant winner here, Craig. No surprise, he was bet down to even money, but Law Professor, you could tell moving down the backstretch that he was traveling like a winner, just waiting for Manny Franco to push the button, and as soon as he did, he went well clear of this field, and this was one of many wins for Manny Franco this past weekend at Aqueduct.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. He was winning a ton of races, it seemed like, every day. So good for him. He's riding in top form, and he has a pretty good horse he was riding right here in Law Professor. He looked like a standout on paper. I know we kind of talked about it on our forecast. We didn't want to take too many chances trying to beat him, and he lived up to it on the track. That was a really nice performance. Wound up with a 121 speed figure. And I would say not a trip that is even ideal to run in a top speed figure. He was a little bit shuffled at the break. He was wide around the first turn, so I wouldn't be surprised if there's not more in the tank for him.
I would agree with that, and I've already seen his connections are toying with the idea of running in the Pegasus World Cup for his next start, and I mean, to that I would say, why not? I mean, when you look at the prospective field for that race, I mean, we've had a lot of retirements in the older horse division, some 3-year-olds that are not going to be competing next year that were at the top of their divisions, or, horses that just were sidelined and won't be coming back, so seems like this older horse division is kind of open right now, so I think if Law Professor's doing well, why not strike while the iron is hot?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's definitely the time, because I haven't looked. I couldn't even probably come up with 3 probables for the race. I just don't know who's left. I guess Cyberknife maybe is pointing to it. And outside of that, I'm not sure who there is to be afraid of.
Yeah, I haven't seen too many confirmations. I know Cyberknife, obviously Skippy Longstocking, who just won the local prep at Gulfstream and did get a pretty big speed figure, which we talked about last week on the show. I don't think Cody's Wish is running, even though he was talked about as one of the invitees to the race. I don't know how much getting invited really matters, but yeah, it just feels like it's not going to be one of the stronger Pegasus World Cup fields. So yeah, a horse like Law Professor, why not take a shot in a race like that? Move on to the one other stakes they ran at Aqueduct this past weekend. That was on Sunday's card for the New York breds. The Say Florida Sandy going 7 furlongs for the older horses. And Greg, what do you think now? He's just back in top form since he got back to Aqueduct in the wintertime. This is definitely the track where he's achieved most of his success throughout his career, and it just seems like he's doing very well right now for Rudy Rodriguez. Different circumstances than his last victory when he won in December at Aqueduct. That was a wet track. He was over a drier surface on Sunday, and he had to work a little bit harder for it, but it was a similar result, another victory.
Yeah, one thing, I don't often pay as much attention to the TimeformUS track condition rating as on dirt as I do on turf, but he certainly seems to be one of those horses that likes a pretty dull, slow track, which is what he had at Aqueduct on Sunday. Even when he won at Saratoga, it was an unusually slow track that day. It was rated just a 4 by TimeformUS. And when you scroll through his PPs, you see that in almost all his wins. They're all 3s, 4s, 5s. So I don't know exactly what to make of that, but he's a guy that's going to like this Aqueduct track because it's going to be slow throughout the winter.
That's actually a really interesting point, and kind of just thinking about it, you're right. Even when he ran some big speed figures against Allowance Company last year, very slow midwinter surfaces at Aqueduct, so maybe he is a horse that likes that. And when you look at him physically, he's this big, burly, beautiful horse that maybe he just has that natural strength to handle these more demanding surfaces. So perhaps that's something to keep in mind with this horse moving forward. He had to work pretty hard for this victory, but just when you looked at this race on paper, he seemed like the only speed in the race. I will give credit to Kendrick Carmouche and Market Alert, especially after I criticized Kendrick for rating Andiamo a Firenze. Not the case here. He really tried to apply some pressure on the runner-up Market Alert and actually made what do you think now work a little harder on the front end than it seemed like he would have to on paper. But I think doing all that dirty work on Market Alert took away some of his finishing kick, and he just couldn't quite get by what do you think now in the stretch.
Yeah, I think I forgot to mention the speed figure was a 116, so it dropped a little from his big win last time at a mile, where he had things a little easier that day. So good fast horse. He's always going to be tough in these New York bred races, and as we've talked about, particularly at Aqueduct.
Before we move away from Aqueduct, let's briefly go back to Saturday's card, where they ran a New York bred maiden race early in the day that resulted in a pretty impressive victory by Please Be Nice, a Bill Mott first-time starter. And Bill Mott's had a few first-time starters win in recent weeks at Aqueduct. This one, I believe, had been working in company with his filly New York bred I'm Having a Moment, who sold for nearly $500,000 and was an impressive winner, I think, over the holiday break at Aqueduct. And this one is a colt by Violence, but a similarly impressive victory, probably even more impressive as he drew off to win by about 10 lengths here and did set a slow pace, Craig, but when you win the way he did, I'm not sure how much that really matters.
Yeah, I'd agree. It was very impressive. He got a 98 TimeformUS. The final time was a 102. So anytime you win by 10, as easy as he did, I'm not going to assume that's as fast as he could run. I know I'm not a big fan of assuming horses could have gone faster, but when it's their first start and they do it this easy, I would tend to think he's a little quicker than what that figure indicates.
Let's move on to Oaklawn Park, where they ran one stakes last weekend. That was on Saturday, the Pippin Stakes for the fillies and mares going the mile and the 16th distance. And we'll just mention this, Craig, because even though it didn't achieve the fastest speed figure, Lovely Ride has now won 2 stakes in a row at Oaklawn. This Robertina Diodoro trainee, it seems like she's really responded now to routing on dirt, especially since they've been making use of her early speed. And once again, this race was just dominated on the front end.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a theme in these races we're going to talk about at Oaklawn. She jumped up to, I think it's a career best figure, 112. The top two ran 1-2 all the way around the track. I don't want to take too much away from her, but I think some of these figs we're going to talk about may have been influenced somewhat by the track, including hers.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the TimeformUS chart, and I do see that pink color coding indicating a slightly speed-favoring surface. And when you watch this race, you just kind of get that impression. There really wasn't a whole lot of running going on from the back of the pack. The only horse that was making up any ground was the favorite, Le Davida, who got up for third here. And I don't know if it's just Oaklawn that's not agreeing with her. Looking back through her PPs, you can make a case that she rode a minor outside bias when she won that allowance race in late October at Keeneland, so maybe her form isn't quite as good as that number would indicate, but you could also argue that she might have run the best race against the track here.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what to make of her going into the race. I didn't play this race, but I thought maybe she was being a little overbet. But I tend to be on your side. I'm willing to give her an excuse here because just the way the track was playing in this race in particular was run. And seeing she was the only horse making up any ground at all, I thought she ran pretty well.
It's hard to get too excited about that Pippin Stakes when you just scroll one race back in the chart and you see that an allowance race at the exact same mile and a 16th distance went over a second faster. And this was for male older horses, but the winner, Keystone Field, definitely put in a huge performance. This 8-year-old gelding just seems like he's been in fantastic form since they've decided to concentrate on dirt racing with him, because he had spent most of the early part of his career on the turf, but definitely is making the case that he's a better dirt horse at this stage of his career, and he was much the best, winning this race by over 4 lengths.
Yeah, I had to go back and look when I made the figure, and I was like, who the heck is this that ran a 121 at Oaklawn? And pulled it up and saw it was Keystone Field. And as you say, he's a horse who is at the age of 8 and definitely career best form, particularly since moving to the dirt full time. Again, I think maybe the track aided that 121 speed figure a little bit. When you looked at the top 3 went 1, 2, 3 all the way around the track, but he did at least pass the 2 in front of him and powered away to win. So I don't want to blame put everything on the racetrack. It was a good performance by him.
Definitely. He got a perfect trip, but I mean, he really slammed the door on this field through the stretch, drawing off impressively. And he was beating a couple of horses that have shown potential in the past. Great Escape is a horse that's now in the barn of Robertino Diodoro, but he's been stakes place. He's actually a winner of the Canadian Derby up north. And the third place finisher, Open Road, is a highly regarded Brad Cox trainee that was running some nice speed figures in Kentucky last year. So Keystone Field was beating real horses in this race, and off this kind of performance, you have to imagine they'll be thinking about graded stakes races next. Let's move on to another horse that earned that same 121 TimeformUS speed figure this past weekend at Oaklawn Park, and that was on Sunday in another allowance race as Edge to Edge earned that number going 6 furlongs. And kind of similar situation to Keystone Field, Craig, where you're kind of scratching your head wondering where did this performance come from, because he had been a pretty good horse leading up to this, but had never run this kind of number before.
No, and he turned the table on a bunch of horses that were in this field on Sunday, I think this was. And just another powerhouse performance. Again, I'll give the slight caveat that he did it on a track that I think was favoring speed. He went right to the front, set the pace on the inside. He was being pressured a little bit by a horse on the outside of him, but he just drew away and put everybody away. So strong performance, again, with that small track caveat that I do think it carried him a bit.
Yeah, and I mean, the inclination is to say, well, he just set a slow pace and drew off, but it's not like this was a race that completely held together on the front end. The second and third place finishers, they did close. The horses that tried to chase Edge to Edge, they had nothing left in the stretch. So, I mean, he did put away some other speeds to get the job done here. And, I mean, this is a graded stakes quality performance that he put in. But, yeah, you do have to wonder a little bit about whether there were circumstances that were helping him this day. I think you also do have to point out that he's trained by Chris Hartman, and if you've been following Oaklawn a little bit, Chris Hartman hasn't just been winning a lot of races. It seems like every horse that he sends out is running a career best speed figure. So definitely the barn is getting their horses to run extremely well right now, so that has to be factored in too.
Oh yeah, he's red hot, and he's gone through these streaks at times in the pretty recent past. So it is worth keeping an eye on anything he sends out right now.
And speaking of Chris Hartman, we saw another one of his top sprinters in action on Friday at Oaklawn Park. Similar optional claiming race going 6 furlongs, though Tejano Twist didn't run quite as fast as his stablemate Edge to Edge, though different kind of horse, different kind of race, Craig, as Tejano Twist is always going to be at the mercy of how fast they go up front, but boy, does he have some potent finishing kick that he can put in when it counts.
Yeah, he's a horse I'm a fan of, and I was actually surprised. I knew he was running on Friday, so when they did the worksheet, I was a little surprised it came up as only a 111. He's a horse who's almost hit the 120 mark the last couple times out, but when you watch the race, it's kind of, he doesn't break very well, and he basically never looked like he was going to lose, despite being well back. He always, you knew that strong kick was coming, so I'm not going to hold the speed figure against him too much since he ran as a deep closer, and I think he's a little better than that 111 and more like the 118 and 119 we had seen in his prior wins.
And as you were kind of pointing out, this is not a horse like Edge to Edge who came up with this performance out of nowhere. He's been a good horse for a long time. He actually was running some big speed figures even when he was in Brett Calhoun's barn early in his career. Now he's with Chris Hartman, making the 20th start of his career as a newly turned 4-year-old. You don't often see 4-year-olds anymore that have already made 20 starts, just beginning their that season. And he's now won 3 in a row, and he's just one of these horses that seems to have a nose for the wire. He drops far out of contention in his races, but always comes with that big late run. He kind of reminds me of a horse like Caleb's Posse, who I was a big fan of about a decade or so ago. And I think it's time for Tejano Twist to get a chance against graded stakes level competition, because they've run him in some minor stakes at some lower level tracks, a little bit in Kentucky. But I'll be interested to see if he can step up his game and run one of those big speed figures if he gets into a tougher spot, potentially with a faster pace.
Yeah, and I also wonder, I mean, I assume they're going to stick to sprints, but people may forget he actually ran second to Epicenter at Fairgrounds last December of 21 in the Gun Runner Stakes. Now, it was a pretty well-beaten second, but it's not like he's shown. He actually finished ahead of Rich Strike that day, by the way, just a kind of little side note. But I don't think they're strictly limited to sprints. He might be worth taking a shot stretching out again.
Let's move on to Gulfstream Park, where they ran a few stakes last week, and we're just going to talk about one of them, the Dania Beach, for the 3-year-olds on the turf, going, I believe, the 1 mile distance, and had a pretty impressive winner of this race, Craig, in Candidate, who took a big step forward from a speed figure standpoint and arguably had the best trip in doing so, just setting the pace on the front end. But this is a horse that has been quickly improving ever since he got on the turf. He is 3 for 3 on that surface, but he has been running better and better in each of those successive victories, and he beat a pretty good horse here in Major Dude, the heavy favorite.
Yeah, and it should be noted his 2 prior wins came in races with really slow paces that he finished off and drew away, so they definitely might have held the speed figure back, even with the boost we give. Saying that, though, I'm guessing he's going to get around a 112. My assistant's been doing Gulfstream. 112 would be huge, but I really don't know. It could be... I'll just wait and put it out there when he sends me the figures later today as we record this on Tuesday. It's one of those where they've changed everything at Gulfstream, so they're really tough to come up with on the turf. They've changed the timing system. They're using all new rail and run-ups than they've used in the past, so it's just... we're kind of learning as we go on the speed figure. So I'll talk more about that in coming weeks as we learn more and make these numbers. But for now, they kind of all come with at least a little bit of an asterisk.
I hear you on that, and you always kind of don't know with these 3-year-olds that can be improving, how big of an improvement did they make coming into these races, because sometimes these races will come up very fast, and you wonder if they all improved at the same time, but it can certainly happen when they just turn 3 in January. As far as the pace of this race goes, obviously, with the numbers not in the chart yet, I can't speak to what the TimeformUS pace figures will say, but just kind of looking at this race compared to the other stakes they ran on the card in race 9, the Ginger Brew, This one featured a slower pace, at least to the half mile. I think they went 2/5 slower to the half, but the final time was over a second faster. So they really sprinted home at the end of this race, or at least Candidate did. And I do want to give some credit to Major Dude, who I don't think lost anything in defeat trying to chase this horse home. I mean, he got a pretty good trip too, all things considered, but it's just hard to reel in a quality speed that gets loose on the front end like Candidate did.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the pace, because Candidate had been coming out of those slower pace races, and looking at it, you might think that's the case here. The half mile pace figure is going to be moderate. It may be borderline blue, but they really picked it up from the half to the 3/4 and then maintained it all the way to the wire, basically running the same figure at the finish as the 3/4. So this wasn't the kind of flow that he's had in his prior 2 races. He had to work mid-race.
That's good to know, because it did seem like he really came with a big burst of speed coming off the turn at the top of the stretch. Just visually, he opened up on the field at that point, cutting the corner and doing so. But this is a horse, the turf horse, that has quite a turn of foot and is pretty handy with early speed. So definitely some positive attributes for Candidate, a horse that doesn't have some huge turf pedigree, I should note. I mean, by Exaggerator, who you don't think of as a big turf sire. I think the dam was a West Virginia bred stakes winner at Charlestown. So, I mean, it's not really a big turf pedigree here, but clearly this horse loves the green stuff. Let's move on to one more race from Gulfstream Park. This last weekend on Sunday, they ran an allowance race for the 3-year-olds that I know a lot of people were watching pretty closely, because Todd Pletcher had a couple of promising debut winners that were making their second starts in here. Both of them, though, went down to defeat, as it was the more experienced Dale Romans trainee Cyclone Mischief, who won this race very impressively, obviously getting some class relief coming out of the Kentucky Jockey Club, but he took a real step forward here.
He did, both visually and figure-wise. He's going to get a 103 or so, I would guess, and this looks like a more easy figure to make than the turf figures I was talking about. And as you said, he beat some horses that came in with some pretty good reputations. He was coming out of that Kentucky Jockey Club, which was, for me, as kind of a really oddly run race for him. You rarely see a horse finish 7th, beating only 2 lengths. He had set a really slow pace in that one, which kind of bunched up the field, and I think that's a really weird racing, and one that's going to be hard to analyze even going forward, just because of the slow, I mean, super slow pace and the way it was bunched off. So I'm going to put a line through that one. This one is one, I think if you skip that one and look at his other 2, he's won them by pretty impressive margins, and really looks like a 3-year-old moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree with that. He took a big step forward here. We'll see if he's able to translate this form to Stakes Company. Obviously, he was making his first start on Lasix here, and he'd have to come back off Lasix if he's going back into stakes race to try to make the Kentucky Derby. And, I mean, just to be honest, you know, the Dale Romans bar, they've had some 3-year-olds come along that have looked pretty impressive in the past, and sometimes they don't take those next steps in Stakes Company. So we'll see if this one is able to, do a little bit better than he did in the Kentucky Jockey Club in his prior start. But I mean, Craig, I think the big story of this race was just, Rutter's Men, who was bet down to 6-5. He had debuted on Cigar Mile Day at Aqueduct, had looked so impressive, winning, I believe, that 7-furlong race. It wasn't just the stretch out in distance, because he was done coming around the far turn after about 5 furlongs. He threw in the towel. Just an odd, big regression for the second-time starter from Todd Pletcher.
Yeah, I'm one that talks about the Aqueduct track. Sometimes what happens at Aqueduct just doesn't translate, because the tracks are just so different than what we're going to see when they move, particularly going down to Gulfstream. I mean, it's like night and day. So maybe he just didn't handle the track more, or maybe he loved Aqueduct.
And as far as the winner goes, Cyclone Mischief, he is by Into Mischief, obviously, given that name, but there is some stamina on the bottom side of his pedigree. The dam is actually a half-sister to Sudden Breaking News, who some people might remember. He was that, Silky Sullivan type of horse that was running at Oaklawn about 6 or 7 years ago. I think he was my pick in the 2016 Kentucky Derby, and he passed a dozen horses in the stretch, but still only finished 4th or 5th. So there's definitely some pedigree to go longer for Cyclone Mischief down the line. Let's close things out with one more race going to a venue that we don't often visit at this time of year. That is Parks, where they ran a couple of stakes early in the week, I think on both Tuesday and Wednesday, but we're going to talk about one race from their Wednesday, January 4th card, and that was the Chris Kringle Stakes, going the 1.70-yard distance, and riding with Biden, Craig. I mean, he's not going to be the kind of horse that you expect to win Grade 1 stakes races anytime soon, but he's been in good form for a long time, wins at a variety of distances, and he was pretty game to get the job done here early last week.
Yeah, we've talked about him on this show before. He's a guy that always seems to show up. He loves to find the winner's circle. He runs fast races for the most part. He got a 118 for this win and was just as game as could be, holding off a Matter of Time, who was a long shot in here, but also a horse who have run some fast races. And this was a pretty salty group that he beat. A lot of horses that have run, 115, 118 type speed figures. So it wasn't a walk in the park for him.
Yeah, and this was a pretty quick pace where there were 5 horses that were vying for the lead early, and I think Riding with Biden was the widest of those 5. So, I mean, he was way out there going around the clubhouse turn, and a Matter of Time, the horse that he finished in a photo with, he completely missed the break in this race, was far back, but I think that's where you wanted to be given the pace of this. I mean, it was kind of falling apart at the end, and credit to Riding with Biden, you could see was really tired in the final eighth of a mile, and Paco Lopez was kind of looking around because they knew somebody was coming, and he was just trying to motivate this horse to find a little something extra, and he did so, just getting his nose down on the wire first. So a really likable horse, and as you said, he earned a pretty respectable speed figure here.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at his PPs once he was gelded. Sometimes you don't notice a big difference, but he's one, it's just been huge. He was a horse who occasionally could maybe crack the 100 speed figure mark, and then he got gelded, and the 1-teens are the norm.
Well, Craig, that's all the racing to recap on this week's Pacecast. We'll continue with our 2 podcasts a week schedule now that we're back into January in 2023, and we'll come back with our TimeformUS forecast a little bit later in the week. Craig, I'll admit I haven't looked too far ahead. I know we're handicapping a couple of Tampa Bay stakes for DRF if you check out our videos on their YouTube channel this week, but I mean, there are some stakes going on at Oaklawn. I think the 5th season is their feature on Saturday. The La Cañada is being run out at Santa Anita, so we'll find something interesting to talk about.
Yeah, I'm like you. I don't look too far ahead. I'm usually a Thursday, Friday kind of guy when it comes time to do our videos. That's when I start looking at the PPs. But yeah, this time of year, we can always find something to look at. There's going to be plenty of good racing at various spots around the country.
Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in to the TimeformUS Pacecast this week. Remember that you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcasts, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for listening, and make sure to check out that TimeformUS forecast coming out later in the week.